This screencast forms part 2 of an introductory talk on psychoanalytic ideas which inform psychodynamic counselling. In part 1, we considered Freud's 2 models of how the mind worked. In part 2, we look at ideas Freud had about how the mind developed over time, how developmental issues cause anxiety, and how the ego protects itself from such anxiety. Freud put forward a model of psychological development which progressed in stages, beginning in infancy. His earliest stage of psychological development is the oral phase. In this phase, an infant is preoccupied with his mouth and with feeding, and he explores the world around him by putting anything and everything into his mouth. Later stages include anal and genital stages, where these areas become a central preoccupation for the infant. Next, an Oedipal phase, where the infant is eager to possess the parent of the opposite sex and do away with the same-sex parent. "Go away, Mummy, I'm going to marry Daddy," a little girl might say. Finally, the child enters a period of latency before puberty and adolescence begin to take effect. Freud considered that impulses arising in the various phases of development sometimes conflicted with external expectations, or expectations from parents or other important people in the child's life, and from the child's own superego. For instance, the infant might experience, or imagine, a strong negative reaction from caregivers for putting everything in his mouth, or for being interested in his feces or his genitals. This raises anxiety in the infant. At this very early stage, the infant's ego is not strong enough or mature enough to be able to deal effectively with this level of anxiety through negotiating effectively between the id impulses and the superego or parental prohibitions or demands. Freud considered that to prevent the infant from being overwhelmed by anxiety, he might employ a number of defense mechanisms to protect his ego. These same defense mechanisms may also be deployed in later life, when anxiety again threatens to overwhelm him. These mechanisms include, amongst others, repression, projection, and sublimation. In repression, the troublesome feelings or impulses are rendered unconscious, pushed out of the conscious mind, so to speak, so that conflict between these id impulses and the parental or superego demands are no longer consciously experienced by the ego. In projection, the troublesome feelings or impulses are denied by the ego, and in unconscious fantasy, are split off and expelled into the outside world. This removes the immediate threat to the ego. However, it results in the infant, or person, seeing the projected impulses or feelings in exaggerated form located in the outside world. For example, other people may appear excessively greedy if greed was the troublesome impulse projected away from the ego. In sublimation, the ego may invest the energy associated with the troublesome impulse into some other activity. For example, rivalrous feelings towards another may be sublimated into socially acceptable actions or behaviours by the person becoming excessively helpful or caring. Anxiety also results from difficult or traumatic experiences during infancy and childhood. Later developments in psychoanalytic thinking have placed much more emphasis than Freud did on such early experiences. Experiences like overly long separations from the primary caregiver, or being looked after by a series of temporary caregivers, as in institutional care, or instances of childhood abuse or neglect.